And we've finished up as far as covering it, I guess, topically in class. We've concluded talking about evangelism. We've by no means talked about everything that you possibly could. We have some tools that are available for anybody who would like those things. And again, evangelism is going to find itself all throughout what we talk about as believers. We're going to start talking about something where evangelism is actually an integral part of what you do. You think the word evangelism just means to tell the good news. And anytime you are talking about God or Christ or making application of God's truth to life, in a sense, you are telling the good news, even if you're not explicitly just talking about the gospel of Jesus. And the reason why I would say that is because the people that we are called to be as God's people is so radically different than the way that the world lives. And we live in a time that has been so drastically altered by Christianity. Even if you want to make the argument that sometimes the way that our culture has been altered is not by biblical Christianity, but at the very least by nominal Christianity, our culture has been so affected by it that we don't realize sometimes how bad things used to be. I remember reading in college, one of the things that we were assigned reading were letters. Letters from Romans back and forth to one another. And there was a short turn of phrase in one of the letters that sticks with me even to this day. The accounts are going well. The move to North Africa was wise. If the child is an infant, if the child is a girl, by the way, expose it. If it is a boy, name him Lucius. As a husband writing to his wife and offhandedly mentions, apparently she's with child, offhandedly mentions that if the child is a girl, of course you would expose it to kill it. But if it is a boy, this is what I want the child to be named. Can you imagine correspondence like that between people in our country today? Maybe we're getting back, maybe, to that point. But it was a dark place. Dark place. We don't even realize how much the relationship between people has been changed. In the ancient world, a father was the master of his children. If it was a male child, until the boy was 16 or 17 years old, at which point he would become human, and at that age he could no longer legally kill them. He could abandon them, he could send them out of his house, but he could no longer legally kill a boy when they were 16 or 17 years old. The boy did not fully become a man until he was 25. A daughter he could legally kill until she was married, at which point then her husband could legally kill her. And so that's the world that they lived in. People would show up and have 5 children one day and 3 the next, and nobody would care. A man would be married one day and not the next, and nobody would care. That's just the way it operated. And so Christianity is radically different. Radically different. The call that you read when you come through passages like in Ephesians chapter 5, where it talks about the husband sacrificing himself for the woman, the father not provoking his children to wrath. Those types of things, we hear those and we're like, well, of course, obviously that's what you do. But it's really not so obvious. It's not so obvious when you look at human history. You go back all the way to Genesis and you have in the garden the man and the woman, they're eating the fruit and God coming and cursing the serpent. And the curse for the serpent is that the child of the woman will crush his head, he will bite the child's heel. Then he turns and he's talking to the woman and he says, your desire will be for your husband, but he shall rule over you. And that's an interesting turn of phrase. In chapter 4 of Genesis, chapter 4, when God is talking to Cain, he says that sin's desire is for you, and it is crouching at the door. And so the question then is in Genesis chapter 3, when God comes to the woman and says, your desire is for your husband, but he shall rule over you. Does that mean that God is telling the woman, you're really going to love your husband, but he's not going to like you back? Is that what that means? Or is it saying that you are going to want to dominate your husband, but he is going to dominate you instead? So what you see post-curse is conflict. Before, whatever it looked like before, there's no conflict. Afterward, there's only conflict. And that is the ancient world. If you wanted to describe the relationship between humans in the ancient world, it would be a good word would be conflict, sort of just to encapsulate what humanity was like. And so you come to the New Testament, and so many of the things in the New Testament are contrary to that idea of conflict. As far as it is possible with you, be at peace with all people. That's the instruction given to the Romans. And we would say, well, of course, that's what nice people do. But that's not the way that the world operates, that it used to operate. And so we're putting all these things out there as just kind of a foundation to help us understand that in Christianity, what you are called to be is a radically different thing as a human. In Christ, God is making a new humanity. A new humanity. And so you kind of see this, right? It's sort of prefigured in the curse, or in the flood. So after the curse, things just get worse and worse and worse and worse until you get to Genesis chapter 6. And does anybody remember what Genesis 6 says about humanity? What were they like? Yeah, their thoughts were only evil continually. Your translation may say the intentions of their heart were only evil continually. Same thing, right? Same thing. And so it's just not a good picture of where people went. And so God comes and he says, I'm done putting up with this. I'm going to flood the earth. And there was one person who was righteous, Noah, and he comes to him and he says, I want you to build an ark. And so he does. And those people sail through the water and God saves them. At the end of that, the text talks about a new creation. God recreated the creation is the picture. Jeremiah, we use the prophet of turning a plate over and wiping the crumbs off. That's sort of what God did. He turned the plate over and he wiped the crumbs off the earth. He cleansed it, and he begins a new humanity in Noah. And that is sort of the picture that you get when you get to the New Testament, where the whole process of salvation is sort of likened back to that moment in that great cataclysm in the flood, and in 1 Peter chapter 3, in a variety of places throughout the New Testament that we'll look at some tonight. And the idea is that you are being remade, we are being remade as a new creation. There is a new heavens and a new earth, and we are being part of that, right? God is making everything again, so to speak. And you can see that maybe more explicitly in places like 2 Corinthians chapter 5. So let's look over there real quick. We're going to read some things that Paul writes. So starting in verse 16, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, he says, from now on, therefore, we no longer regard anybody according to the flesh. Even though we once regarded Christ according to the flesh, we regard him thus no longer. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has passed away, behold, the new has come. And all of this is from God, who through Christ reconciled us to himself and gave us this ministry of reconciliation. That is, in Christ, God is reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, and entrusting to us this message of reconciliation. And so Paul's argument, or what he's putting forth then, is that when you come to Christ, you used to be one way. But now in Jesus, through being reconciled to God, you have been remade. You are a new creation. And that phrase, when you hear the word creation, where does your mind go? It should, to Genesis. Yeah, that's on purpose. The words that are chosen in the New Testament, one of the writers that I like to read, he uses the phrase callback words. It's supposed to call you back to certain events. And if you were a Greek speaker, it will do that even more, because the word is the exact word that is used throughout the Old Testament to describe the creation in Genesis. And so when you are this new creation, you're a new Genesis. Right? You're being remade. Like God over in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 26 said, let us make humanity in our image. Male and female, he created them in the image of God. That, in Genesis 1 and 26 and 27, that's what God is doing now. When somebody comes to Christ and is reconciled to God through Jesus, they're remade in God's image through Jesus. And so that seems to be what's going on here. You can see this in other places, like over in Galatians chapter 6. If you look at the end of Galatians chapter 6. So Paul is writing here at the end. He probably has somebody writing for him. Sometimes we'll use the term secretary, somebody who's recording something. The term that they'll use to describe it with the biblical things is amanuensis, is the word. So if you ever come across that and you're like, what in the world is that? It's somebody who writes down the dictation of another. And so so this letter up to this point has probably been written by a professional scribe, maybe somebody who's helping Paul, who writes his letters. And he's going through, and he says, see with what large letters I am writing to you with my own hand. And so it's like kindergartners or first graders when you're teaching them to write and they give you those big chief writing pads. Do you remember those? Where the lines on them are just huge. Why do we give them the big chief writing pads? Well, they have big pencils, right? And they kind of grab them with their fists, and right? Because they're not skilled. It is a highly specialized skill to write small. Right? You have to have very, very great muscle control to write small, and you gain that over years of practice in writing. So Paul, not a professional scribe, when he sits down to write, he basically has his big chief writing pad, and here he is, and he's saying, look, I'm writing to you. And the problem he's going through here is that there are people who want to make a good show according to the flesh. And remember over in 2 Corinthians 5, we regard nobody according to the flesh any longer. So the physical creation is not really what we're thinking about anymore. If we did that, then we wouldn't be persecuted at the end of verse 12. And so then he's going to say down in verse 16, for everybody who walks, or verse 15, sorry, for neither circumcision counts for anything nor uncircumcision. In other words, whether you're Jewish or Gentile, that doesn't matter, but a new creation. And for everyone who walks by this rule, peace and mercy be upon them and upon the Israel of God. So he has just said, whether you're Jewish or Gentile, it doesn't matter, but what matters is that you're part of God's Israel. So who is God's Israel? Christians. Christians. Because God has recreated people in the image of Jesus. He has reselected a nation. He has called all these people out, and you're seeing the spiritual fulfillment of all these physical things. And so that's sort of what he's arguing. The entire letter of Galatians, one of the key points is that stop thinking about things, about people, according to the flesh. And that's Galatians chapter 3, where you have that wonderful passage where he's going to say, for as many of you as were baptized into Christ have put on Christ. And now, when we read that, we probably focus in on baptism. But I would argue that in the first century, the thing that was sort of like an issue, the thing that would have stood out to people was not that individuals are being baptized, but for as many of you. Everyone who was baptized. Whether you're a Gentile or a Jew, whether you're a male or a female, whether you're a slave or free, whether you're anything, if you have been baptized into Christ, then you have these promises. And so his argument is that it seems to be that this isn't about who you used to be, it's about who you are now, because in verse 28, there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, you are all one in Christ Jesus. And that's sort of the context there of that quote. If you are Christ's, then you are Abraham's offspring, whether you're man or woman or Jew or Gentile, it doesn't matter. And you have this promise. Because God is making for himself a new humanity. And he has a new way for us to live. You can see this, it's also emphasized over in Ephesians chapter 2. If you want to start looking in Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 11. Remember that you at one time, the Gentiles in the flesh. But remember, we're not regarding people according to the flesh anymore, but the new creation. But you who at one time were Gentiles, you were called the uncircumcision by those who call themselves the circumcision, which is made by hands. Remember that you were separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, as strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. In other words, you were away. You were separated. But now in Christ, you who were far off have been brought nearer by the blood, for he himself is our peace and has made us both one, and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility. Probably a reference back to the temple complex in Jerusalem there. For a long time, I thought maybe the dividing wall was the curtain. I don't think that's in the temple. It's probably this wall that was in the temple complex, and there were plaques all along the wall, and the plaque warned Gentiles not to cross. If you crossed this wall, the Jews would kill you. And now God, in Jesus, has broken that wall down. And there is no longer this division between Jew and Gentile, but now everybody is one. And he is our peace, and he has made us both one, breaking down that dividing wall of hostility. Now, the reason why all of this is significant and all of this is important is because if God is making for himself a new people, then he is going to have for them a new way to live. The issue with humanity the first time they come is that they start trying to do things on their own. And that really seems to be the issue with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, is they're trying to be like God. They are trying to decide what is good and evil. They're trying to decide what they're going to do and not do, what's right and what's wrong. And in doing that, they make themselves like God. Right? I mean, Satan's not lying when he says, when you eat this, you'll be like God. That's exactly what they're doing. They are taking God's place, making themselves idols. And that leads to that darkness in chapter 6, where the thoughts and intentions of their hearts are only evil continually. So humanity left to ourselves, it's bad. And so God, in recreating humanity, is going to give us, when we come to Christ, in a sense, we're kind of going back to the garden, and things are being reset in Jesus. And now that they're being reset, this new humanity in Jesus, we're going to be given a new way to live. And that is going to make up the bulk of the epistles, this thought of you as a Christian. Now you have a new way to live because of what God has done for you in Jesus. That's in Romans chapter 12. After Paul has spent the first 11 chapters arguing that you are justified by faith in Christ, and it's for everybody because God has shut up the whole creation under sin, but now that Christ has come, you can be saved. And he starts off in chapter 12 by saying, I beg you, I appeal to you by the mercies of God, what he has done for you in Jesus, that you stop being the way that you were. Right? I think that's how he would word it if he was from the United States today. Stop being who you were, but now be changed and become the new people that God has made you to be. And you're going to see that in Ephesians chapter 5. As beloved children, be imitators of God. Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, when he goes through and talks about all the Beatitudes, and he talks about all the different ways of living, ultimately it comes down to being like God. When you think of how loving God is, when you think of how patient God is, when you think of how generous God is, that's what we are being called to be. We're being called to be like God. And so the way that we view the world and the way that we view one another is changing. And as we talk about this idea of being a new humanity, one of the things that we're going to talk about throughout the year, again, being an everyday disciple or being a disciple in the 21st century, what that looks like for the rest of this quarter through the end of February, what we're going to talk about specifically is we're going to talk about family and home. And when we think about that, again, it's wide-ranging. Because when you think about family, one of the most interesting questions that I ever was asked was, how many people does it take to have a family? One. If we, right, I can't point to a biblical passage that says a family consists of one or more people. It's not there. But when you think about what you see in the text, if you live by yourself, it's not like you're not a family. Right? There's not something missing from you. You're not delinquent or deficient or incomplete in any way. You're not half of a human because you're by yourself. Right? These are all ideas that have sort of entered into culture, sort of religious culture. When you go and you read books about home and family, it always assumes that the audience is 35 years old, they're married, and has 3 children. Actually, 2.4 children, I think, is the assumption. Right? That's like what most of the books about family are written thinking of. But when you come to the reality and you look at what makes a family, it can be one person. And if that one person gets married, well, now the family has just grown. And when 2 people, if they have children, they may not. If they do, it's not like they become a family once they have kids. like they were deficient or there was something missing, but the family has just grown. When somebody comes to live with you, maybe an aunt or an uncle or a grandmother or a mother or a father, and now they come and live with you, now they may have, you consider them part of your family, but now they have come into your household and the family has grown. In the ancient world, in the first century, the word household was very broad, right? It might be one person, it might be two people, it might be three people, it might be 100 people, it might be kinfolk, it might be extended family, it might be servants, it might be business associates, it might be multiple what we would consider family groups living together. Very, very broad, because they talked about households. And so when we think about what we would consider talking about family and home, I think that's a helpful thing to think of. Household is a better word. It's a much broader word. It encompasses a group of people, whether there is one or 100. It encompasses groups of people, whether they're all related genetically or not. It encompasses close friends that wind up living together, maybe roommates, is a phrase that we would use. But all of these things would be encompassed in that idea or that concept of household. And we see this when Jesus is talking like to his disciples in John, where he says, "In my Father's house are many dwelling places, and I'm going to get them ready for you." That's sort of the idea. He's talking in this first century concept of what a household is, where it's not just kinfolk. It is, thankfully, we are kinfolk to Jesus, but it encompasses everybody. When Cornelius is baptized, he and his household, right? It doesn't just mean he and anybody that he is genetically related to. He seems to be a fairly wealthy person. It probably includes servants as well. Right? People that we wouldn't consider, part of the family, they did in the ancient world. And so that is what we're talking about. It's broad in scope. And so as we start talking about who we ought to be as God's new creation in this idea of a household, it's going to be much broader than just thinking like a family unit, what we would consider in our culture a family unit. And when you start thinking about this idea, there are both collective and individual responsibilities. One of the dangers when you start talking about this is we start thinking about my family versus yours. And all I have to do is get my family right, and that's my responsibility. And often when people in the past have asked me for information or studies or to talk about family, that's what they wanted. They wanted a very narrow path of how do I raise my children and how do I fulfill whatever other relationship roles that I have, uncle, father, grandpa, that. And that's not wrong, but that's only half of the picture. We have collective responsibilities when it comes to family also. Paul, writing the epistles in the New Testament, will talk about these different things. And what business does he have telling you how to live your life? Who is he to tell you how to live? Why is he messing around with your finances? Who is he to tell you whether you ought to give or not? Who is he to tell you how to treat your children? Where does he get off doing this? Well, there's collective responsibility. The Christians throughout time have recognized this. One of, again, there's different readings that I was assigned in school. History of Christianity at Texas A&M is a fabulous class. If you ever have the opportunity to take it, it's taught by an atheist. Interestingly enough. One of the things, it was from the 3rd century, actually late 4th century, sorry, talking about a father who would not teach his children. And our answer to that generally is to kind of be like hands off. Well, that's his family. If he doesn't teach them, that's his business. And in the 300s, the church's responsibility was for the deacons to go and visit him and to encourage him to teach his children. And if he wouldn't listen to the deacons, then the elders would go, and they would encourage him. And if he wouldn't listen to them, then a group of men, a big group of men from the church would go and encourage him to teach his children. And if he still wouldn't do it, some of the healthy deacons would go and have a conversation with him until he came to the conclusion that he should teach his children. The healthy deacons encouraging him is left to your interpretation. They very much saw it, right? They very much saw it. That's probably going a bit far. But they very much saw it as their responsibility. It wasn't, well, that's just his business. They had a collective responsibility. They saw these smaller groups, whatever they were comprised of, as part of a collective larger group. Sort of like in the military, we take a large group of forces and we divide it down in commanders. You can see that in the Old Testament too, commanders of thousands, commanders of hundreds, commanders of tens. And you do that because you work functionally in smaller units. And as the smaller units function well and they interact well, you can work more cohesively as a larger unit. And each one of those units has a responsibility to the others and to those who are above them, and to look out for those who are below them. And that is one of the dangers of the American concept of studying family in religion, is that we get into this thinking where all I have to do is look out for mine, and as long as mine is good, then it's good. But there's more. All right, so we collectively are the temple of God. Ephesians 2, we were just reading from that. You all, plural, are being built into a temple of God. You can look in 1 Corinthians 6, where you individually have the Spirit dwelling in you, and you are a temple of God individually. And so we see these individual responsibilities and collective responsibilities. Regarding with being generous with our blessings, somebody warned me when I started preaching that there are very few things that will get you in trouble faster than talking about money. When you read through the New Testament, the way he worded it is there is no nerve more sensitive in a person's body than the one attached to their pocketbook. I thought that was funny. And so when you start looking at being generous, right, there are collective responsibilities. We see churches deciding to do things. In Acts chapter 11, when the prophet Agabus comes and prophesies about a famine that is going to come through Judea, the saints decide, right? The local church there decides in verses 27 through 30 to send a contribution. And the way that they do that is each person individually, as they are able, is going to contribute to that. So there's this collective responsibility. We're all going to do this, and then it is fulfilled through these individual actions. In 1 Corinthians chapter 16, when Paul is writing there in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, and he talks about how on the first day of every week, each one of you is to set something aside so that when I come, there will be no collecting. The strictest way to interpret that is that you're to set something aside at home. And then when Paul arrives, you bring what you have been setting aside at home. Like sometimes people will do that, maybe if they're saving for a vacation, they'll get like a giant pickle jar and they'll put it on the counter and they'll just like throw their change at the end of the day in the pickle jar. That's kind of what Paul is saying. At a set interval, put something in the pickle jar so that when it's time, you've paid for your vacation. Right, so he's saying that with this big gift, apparently, that they have promised. Every once in a while, put something in the pickle jar, and then when I show up, you don't have to go sell half of your property in order to get the money that you have promised, but you have done this over time. That's the strictest way to read that. That is very individual. He's speaking to you as an individual. And he's also going to talk over in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, same group, about the same gift, in a very collective way. All of you promised this. You need to make sure, you can see this in 2 Corinthians 8, verses 8 through 15, you need to make sure that you finish what you started. And so he looks at this gathering, this collection that they're going to send to the needy saints in Jerusalem from both an individual and a collective level. And the reason why that's important is because when we start talking about anything regarding our life as new people, this new humanity in Christ, there is going to be individual and collective responsibilities, individual and collective associations. And so when it comes to raising children, right, there is nobody in this church that does not have some obligation to help raise the children of the believers here. There is nobody who can say, oh, that's not my business. We have a collective responsibility to one another to make sure that the children who are part of this spiritual family are being taught what they need to be taught, are being encouraged to be who they need to be, are being admonished when they make mistakes, and are being brought up in the discipline and admonition of the Lord, to borrow that phrase over from Ephesians. And so there's nobody who can say, well, that's not my job. Because we have that collective responsibility, just like nobody in Acts chapter 11 could say, oh, well, that gift to the saints in Jerusalem, that's not my responsibility. No, it was everybody's. And at the same time, you can't just depend on the collective either. If you have kids, you can't say, well, they go to Bible class on Wednesday, that's enough. Somebody else will teach them, that's enough. It's not. Just like you couldn't say, well, there's a lot of people who are pitching money in to help those saints in Jerusalem. I don't have to do anything. There's enough. No, 1 Corinthians 16 is written to every single person there. Put something aside, you individually. And so when we start thinking about family, there's nobody in the church here who can say, oh, well, I'm not a husband, or I'm not a wife, or I'm not an aunt and uncle, or a parent. Nobody gets to say that. Because no matter what you're doing, our collective responsibility is to make sure that we, as the new humanity in Christ, are being who we ought to be. And this isn't like don't think of it as like, well, now I have to be the police for the whole church, and I have to run around, and I have to play cop and make sure everybody's, no. That's really not the idea. And when Paul is talking to those people, he's not talking to them in a negative way in 1 Corinthians 16, right? He's helping them. He's like, hey, y'all made a huge gift. You promised a huge gift. Here's some wisdom in how you can reach that gift without killing yourself when it's time. In 2 Corinthians 8, when maybe it seems like they've been faltering, he doesn't say, what's the matter with you people? You bunch of deadbeats? He doesn't say that. He's like, hey, remember that wonderful thing that you said you were going to do? Look at these other believers who are doing incredible things. You could do that and more. And so this is a very positive thing, where we have the opportunity to encourage one another. Like you can read over in Hebrews chapter 10, to stir one another up to love and good works. So we now, as the spiritual family here, are set to stir one another up, to be the humanity that we ought to be men and women who make sure that we are walking in the wisdom that God has revealed to us, and that we are different from the world, and that we are not falling back into what humanity was before Christ came. But now we, as new creations, as new people, are walking in step with the Spirit. We're living according to the fruit of the Spirit, and that we're doing all of the things that you will see Paul sort of give direction. It's just amazing to think that there were people in the first century who did not know how to be a human. And the instruction that you see in the New Testament text is, first of all, this is what it means to be a human, being made in God's image, which would be radically different from the way that the Greeks viewed themselves. Not only are you made in God's image, but you then, as an image bearer of God, this is how you are to live. It's interesting to think that they didn't know. Okay, so if we're going to start looking at it as a collective, so we here at Brentwood are a family. Do you ever call anybody brother or sister? Yeah, I've heard you do it. What does it mean when you say that? Yeah. Yeah, how do you have that family relationship? Through Christ. You've been adopted into the same family. Right? When you get adopted into a family, everybody who is a kid in that family, they're your brothers and sisters. That's how family works. And I mean, we do that with friends. We welcome them in, and there are people in my life that I've had a hard time calling them, well, this is my friend. Brother feels more appropriate because of the relationship that you have with them, and that is sort of how Christianity is supposed to work. You know, the brothers and sisters, when Paul writes that, it's not a religious title. I heard somebody preach a sermon one time, and they were talking about religious titles, and it was focusing on the word father. And afterwards, I went to go talk to him, and there was an older woman who came up, and she said, you didn't talk about the most abused religious titles. And he was like, what are you talking about? I talked about father all over the place. And he's like, brother and sister. People use those as religious titles, and they have no relationship with one another, and they throw that back and forth, and that's just a religious title. There was a lot of wisdom in that statement. So we're a family. And when you think about family, we should be interested in one another. We should be concerned for one another. It means we're going to have responsibilities for one another. Ultimately, I mean, I'm responsible for what I do. I need to wake up, I need to eat food, I need to put my clothes on, I need to do all those things, right? I don't expect people to come and do that for me. But at the same time, there's relationships in families. When I woke up and I was in high school, my parents expected me to do all those things. But if I didn't eat breakfast, my mom wouldn't let me leave the house. And so we have, there's this balance between the individual and the collective relationship. What are some of the collective responsibilities that we have to one another? Encouragement. Absolutely. Prayer. Financial support. Yep, when needed. Yeah, looking out for one another in whatever situation people might find themselves in. Wisdom and advice. There are a lot of people here who are better at a lot of things than me. Right, there are people here who are professional teachers. There are people here who are professional engineers. There are people here who are professional at all sorts of things that I'm just simply not. And so if I have a structural problem with my house, I mean, I can go on the internet and find out how to fix it because the internet's never wrong. Right? Or I can ask somebody that I know who is an expert in that field. And so what you have in your family is the collective wisdom of everyone here in any situation that you might find yourself in. If you happen to be raising children and you don't know what to do, well, I mean, you can bang your head against the wall and you can go on the internet, or you can ask people who have raised children. If you have some kind of emotional distress that you're going through and you don't know how to deal with it, again, you have options where you can try and fix it by yourself, or you can go and talk to people who have maybe dealt with that before, or maybe that's their area of expertise or their knowledge. You can go get spiritual counseling, you can get emotional counseling from people in your family. Or maybe the people in our family know other places where you can go to get resources. And so there's this collective responsibility that we have to one another so that you're not isolated. You don't have to live by yourself. That's what family does. It helps one another. What are some of the individual responsibilities that you have as a member of the family here? Yeah. Yeah, there's the very physical things, like he expects you, if you're able, to labor. Right? One of the things over in Ephesians chapter 4, when Paul is talking to thieves, here's a group of believers, and in their midst they have professional thieves. Think about that. Hi, this is Ralph. He's joined us. He just became a believer last week, and he's a professional thief. And over here we have, that's who was there. And he has to write to these people whose livelihood was thievery, and he has to say, let the thief who stole no longer steal, but work with his own hands so that he might have something to share. Instead of taking, now your obligation as an individual is to give. Right? Assuming that you're able to work or do whatever. And that's just amazing to me that was the situation. What else? What are some of our individual responsibilities? To love. Yeah. To fulfill those two great commandments, to love God and to love others. To love. Uh, Yes. There's a quote. In fact, I have it in my notes. There's a quote, what Eric said, how loving other people doesn't come naturally. Again, Genesis 6. That's where, nature takes you. It's Genesis 6. Here's this quote from a man named Justin Martyr. He was a believer. He was converted early 2nd century, so early 100s, not very long after the apostles. He says, "We used to hate one another and destroy one another, and we refused to associate with people of other races or countries." It literally says tribes or regions, but races or countries is how we would think of it today. Now, because of Christ, we live together with such people, and we have learned to pray for our enemies. And so in his view, he looks out at the world, and he's like, the world hates. You get into your own little collective groups, and you watch out for your collective groups, your tribe or your nation or whatever it is, and then you hate everybody else and you destroy them. Right? You gain through dominating. You gain by taking away from others, and that's how you gain. But he says in Christ, we have learned not to do that. We have learned to associate with the people that we used to hate, and for those who still hate us, we have learned to pray for them. And so that sort of is that individual responsibility. I can't do that for you. That is a transformation that has to take place in you, and as you are being transformed, then you can help other people and their process of change also. And that's sort of the approach that we're going to take throughout the rest of the quarter together, is we're going to look at different things like what does it mean to be a family? What does it mean, or how do you raise children? How do you teach children? How do you have the different relationships that exist within families, aunts, uncles, all of those things, friend, librarian. And as we think about all those different relationships, how then do we live as God's people? And how do we encourage and stir one another up to good works in each one of those things that we see? And so there is going to be both collective and individual responsibilities, so that nobody can say, this isn't my job, or this doesn't apply to me, because we're in this together. And one of the things that is amazing when you get to the churches in Revelation, again, some of the things that John says are happening in these places, never does he ever tell the people whose robes are yet unstained, never does he say, y'all need to get out of there, and you need to go somewhere else. He expects them to work on it together, because they're a family, and that's what family does. I think we're out of time, so we'll go ahead and stop there. Thank you very much. The rest of the time, we're going to have a lot more discussion. I'll do my best to maybe to get some outlines ready ahead of time so that we can all bring thoughts prepared, because again, we're all smarter than any one of us. All of us is smarter than one of us, and so we're going to focus on discussion. Thank you very much.